So I might have killed off the Duke in chapter 20. Now I'm engaged to him. My corset is cutting off my oxygen. And a glowing, floating quill just told me to write a better ending or die. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets, and emotional twists. Let's begin. The cursor mocked me. Blink, blink, blink. I, Penelope Scratch, had consumed my body weight in cheap instant coffee over the last 72 hours. My editor was breathing down my neck for the final chapters of the Duke's demise, the Victorian-era angst fest that had somehow catapulted me to the top of the bestseller list. My readers loved the suffering. They devoured the pain. So naturally, I decided to give them a bloodbath. My fingers flew across the sticky keyboard. I killed off Duke Arthur, the impossibly stoic, broad-shouldered tragic hero, by having him thrown from a horse. Then, for good measure, I wrote a deliciously dramatic scene where the wicked, plotting villainess, Lady Victoria Blackwood, was publicly beheaded for treason in chapter 21. Perfect, I muttered, my vision blurring. A masterpiece of misery. I hit save, rested my heavy head on the keyboard, and let the sweet release of sleep take me. I woke up because I couldn't breathe. My first thought was that I was having a heart attack. My second thought was that my sweatpants had miraculously transformed into something heavy, stiff, and aggressively embroidered. I gasped, my eyes snapping open to behold a sprawling canopy bed draped in crimson velvet. Sunbeams filtered through stained glass windows, illuminating a room that looked like it had been violently sneezed out by a Victorian interior designer. And then I looked down. I was wearing a corset. A corset laced so tightly I could feel my ribs holding a support group meeting. Where am I? I wheezed, attempting to sit up and immediately failing due to the sheer volume of my silk skirts. A soft mechanical ding echoed in the silent room. Directly in front of my face, a glowing, translucent golden quill materialized out of thin air. It floated there for a second before aggressively scribbling glowing words into the empty space above my bed. System initializing. Welcome, creator. Current status: in grave danger. I stared at the floating letters. Did someone spike my coffee? The quill scribbled again, the font turning an irritated shade of red. Host has successfully transmigrated into the body of Lady Victoria Blackwood, Villainess extraordinaire. Current timeline, Chapter 19. Time until host's beheading, 14 days. I scrambled out of the bed, tangling my legs in the sheets, and face planted onto a terrifyingly expensive Persian rug. Hauling myself up by a mahogany vanity, I stared into the silver-backed mirror. Staring back at me was a woman with cascading raven hair, sharp aristocratic features, and villainous, piercing crimson eyes. I touched my face. The reflection mirrored my horror. I was Lady Victoria, the woman I had just condemned to the guillotine. Main quest triggered. The system wrote in the air, the quill flourishing elegantly. Write a better ending. The readers complained your tragedy was contrived and lazy. You have 14 days to change the Duke's fate and avoid decapitation. Warning. Host is currently experiencing severe writer's block. Lazy, I shrieked at the floating notepad, entirely ignoring the decapitation part. That ending was a thematic triumph. Host's thematic triumph is going to separate Host's head from her neck. The system retorted dryly. I suggest you get to work. The Duke is waiting in the drawing room. Try not to get yourself killed before breakfast. Chapter 1. It took 3 maids and a silent, desperate prayer to get me fully dressed. By the time I was stuffed, prodded, and laced into a lavender silk day gown that conservatively weighed more than a healthy golden retriever, I was sweating profusely. My lady, my head maid Betty whispered, her hands trembling as she adjusted the massive, ruffled bustle at my lower back. In my original manuscript, I had written Lady Victoria as a cruel, exacting tyrant who regularly fired her staff for breathing too loudly. Looking at poor Betty's terrified expression, I felt a sharp pang of guilt. The Duke of Blackwood has arrived. He is awaiting you in the primary drawing room. Right, Duke Arthur. My stomach performed a complicated, nervous flip that was immediately halted by the rigid steel boning of my corset. The Duke was the man I had literally just murdered in a Word document not 12 hours ago. I swept down the grand, sweeping mahogany staircase, attempting to recall the precise mechanics of walking without tripping over my own excessive hemline. Every gilded mirror and towering marble bust mocked my current predicament. As I reached the ground floor, A soft, mechanical chime echoed in my ear. The golden quill materialized out of thin air, hovering directly in my line of sight. System alert. The male lead is in close proximity. Prepare for narrative engagement. I took a shallow, carefully measured breath and pushed open the heavy double oak doors to the drawing room. There he was. Duke Arthur Pendleton. He was standing with his back to the roaring fireplace, looking exactly as I had painstakingly described him in Chapter 3. He possessed impossibly broad shoulders tailored to perfection in a charcoal morning suit, raven hair swept back with an effortless elegance, and a jawline sharp enough to slice through a block of aged cheddar. He wore a pristine, snowy white silk cravat. Most importantly, he exuded a palpable, suffocating aura of cold, unapproachable melancholy. He was the quintessential, brooding tragic hero. He was utterly perfect. He was deeply miserable. And I had made him that way. As soon as I stepped over the threshold, the golden quill zipped across the room and hovered mischievously just over Arthur's left shoulder. Main quest task, flirt with the Duke. Goal: increase affection points to alter the tragic plotline and ensure your survival. Penalty for failure: extreme public humiliation. Flirt. A wave of absolute panic washed over me. I write agonizing, tear-jerking tragedies. My idea of sweeping romance involves two emotionally stunted people staring longingly at each other across a rain-swept, foggy moor until one of them tragically succumbs to a highly romanticized bout of consumption. I certainly did not know how to seduce a man whose emotional baseline I had deliberately set to frozen wasteland. Lady Victoria. Arthur spoke, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down my heavily corseted spine. He executed a stiff, shallow bow, his icy blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me want to hide behind the nearest sofa. You requested my presence this morning? Did I? My writer's block slammed into me like a runaway carriage. My mind went completely blank. I had absolutely no dialogue prepared for this scenario. I hadn't outlined a morning parlor visit. I frantically searched my brain for any appropriate, witty rejoinder, but all I found was the mental image of a monkey crashing cymbals together. The system's golden quill began to tap impatiently against an invisible desk in the air, the glowing letters pulsing aggressively. I needed to act coy. I needed to bat my eyelashes and be charming. I decided to employ a classic romance trope. Leaning alluringly against the scenery, I sidled up to the heavy floor-to-ceiling crimson velvet curtains framing the grand bay window, attempting to curve my lips into a sultry, mysterious smirk. "Your Grace," I purred, attempting to pitch my voice an octave lower. I tossed my heavy, pinned curls over my shoulder in what I hoped was a devastatingly attractive manner. "It is a pleasure to see you." Unfortunately, my dramatic, sweeping hair toss disturbed the century-old, undisturbed dust trapped deep within the folds of the heavy velvet drapes. A massive cloud of ancient, microscopic debris exploded directly into my face. My nose twitched violently. My eyes immediately began to water, ruining my attempt at a smoldering gaze. I tried desperately to suppress the impending biological reaction, but the unforgiving corset allowed for absolutely zero breath control. The pressure built up in my chest with the force of a steam engine. I gasped, stumbling away from the curtains. Arthur took a step forward, his stoic facade slipping slightly, a faint flicker of confusion crossing his perfectly sculpted features. "Lady Victoria, are you quite all right?" Achoo. It was not a delicate, ladylike sneeze. It was a violent, full-body explosion that propelled me entirely off balance. I pitched forward, arms flailing wildly, and collided directly into the Duke's solid, broad chest. I squeezed my eyes shut in sheer mortification as I realized what had just happened. I had aggressively, unapologetically sneezed right into the center of his immaculate, snowy white silk cravat. A stunned, suffocating silence descended upon the grand drawing room. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the horrified, muffled gasp of Betty the maid, who was still hovering anxiously in the hallway. I remained frozen, my face buried in the Duke's chest. I waited for him to cast me aside in disgust, cementing my role as the detestable Villainess. Instead, above his shoulder, the system's quill furiously scribbled a glowing red message. "Host, that was unimaginably pathetic. Are you attempting to woo him?" Chapter 2. I remained absolutely frozen against the solid wall of his chest, mortification washing over me in agonizingly slow, paralyzing waves. The scent of sandalwood, crisp winter air, and expensive bergamot soap filled my nostrils. It was a masculine, refined scent that I had spent 3 full pages painstakingly describing in Chapter 4 of my manuscript. At the time of writing, I thought the detailed olfactory description made him seem incredibly distinguished. Now, with my face planted firmly in his lapel and my nasal fluids soaking into his bespoke tailoring, I only felt a profound sense of self-loathing. The silence in the drawing room was so absolute, so thick and suffocating, that I could hear the rhythmic, erratic thumping of my own panicked heartbeat. I could also hear the faint, horrified squeak escaping from Betty's throat as she watched her usually terrifying mistress commit social suicide in broad daylight. Above the Duke's broad shoulder, the golden quill was having an absolute field day. It zipped back and forth with manic energy, leaving a trail of glowing red letters that burned themselves into my retinas. Host, that was unimaginably pathetic. Are you attempting to woo him? Or are you trying to infect him with the bubonic plague? 10 to dignity. 5 to elegance. Plus 100 to gross incompetence. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing the Persian rug would magically open up and swallow me whole. The sheer stress of the looming deadlines, the reality-shattering transmigration, the lack of coffee, and the steel-boned medieval torture device currently compressing my lungs finally broke the last remaining threads of my sanity. I abruptly shoved myself away from the Duke's chest. I didn't gracefully step back. I physically vaulted off him like a startled cat, stumbling over my massive bustle and nearly colliding with a mahogany side table. I pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at the empty air hovering just above Arthur's raven-haired head. "Oh, shut your glowing, judgmental mouth," I hissed vehemently at the floating text. "Let's see you try to act like a perfectly poised seductress while wearing a ribbed corset that is actively trying to sever your internal organs." I didn't even want to write this stupid, complicated scene in the first place. Duke Arthur Pendleton stood perfectly still. To his perspective, and to the terrified perspective of my maid hovering by the doorframe, I was currently screeching like a banshee at a completely empty patch of wallpaper. System advises host to immediately cease acting like an unhinged lunatic. The male lead's suspicion is rising. If he declares you medically insane, your execution might simply be moved up to Thursday. I slapped my hands over my mouth, my eyes darting frantically to Arthur. The reality of my situation crashed down upon me. This was it. He was going to summon the authorities. He was going to have me committed to the royal asylum. The cold, calculating, politically savvy Duke I had written would never tolerate a prospective fiancé who ruined his expensive wardrobe, screamed at ghosts, and exhibited the social graces of a feral badger. I braced myself for the signature, terrifyingly icy glare I had specifically designed for his character sheet. I waited for the sneer of absolute disgust. I waited for him to turn on his polished heel and walk out of my life, sealing my doomed fate. But when I nervously lowered my hands and peeked up at him through my eyelashes, I was met with a thoroughly baffling sight. The corner of Arthur's perfectly sculpted mouth was twitching. His stoic, icy blue eyes, the very eyes I had described as relentless glaciers of sorrow, were entirely devoid of the expected disgust. If anything, they looked remarkably bright. They looked genuinely, undeniably amused. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his charcoal morning coat. He withdrew a crisp, impeccably folded white linen handkerchief, monogrammed with the Blackwood crest in silver thread. He took a single, measured step toward me and held it out. "Are you always this violently expressive, Lady Victoria?" he asked, his deep baritone carrying a strange, unfamiliar warmth. I deeply apologize, Your Grace," I stammered, gingerly taking the handkerchief from his large, gloved hand. I dabbed frantically at my nose, avoiding his gaze. I seemed to be suffering from an acute, sudden case of atmospheric dust. The drapes are ancient. A tragic hazard of historical architecture. Arthur actually chuckled. It was a low, resonant, utterly captivating sound that vibrated through the quiet room. I stared at him in sheer disbelief. I had definitively, absolutely never written that sound into my manuscript. Arthur did not chuckle. Arthur brooded. Arthur stared out of rain-streaked windows and contemplated his tragic past. "Atmospheric dust," Arthur repeated, his tone laced with dry, velvety sarcasm. He casually brushed a speck of lint off his now ruined silk cravat, entirely unbothered by the damp spot I had left behind. How incredibly perilous. I shall have to brave the elements with far more caution when calling upon you in the future. The golden quill floated lazily back into my direct line of vision. It twirled in a triumphant, mocking circle before scribbling a new message. This time, the font shifted from the angry, critical red to a bright, cheerful, pulsating green. Thing. System update. Plus 15 affection points from Duke Arthur Pendleton. Current status. Intrigued. System note. He appears to have an inexplicable, deeply concerning soft spot for unhinged, chaotic behavior. Keep up the good work, you glorious, unpredictable disaster. I stared at the floating green text, then shifted my gaze back to the devastatingly handsome Duke who was currently watching me with an expression of intense, rapt fascination. My writer's block had prevented me from outlining a coherent romantic subplot, but this was entirely off the rails. He was supposed to be a man who valued quiet, subservient gentleness. Why was he looking at me like I was the most thrilling, fascinating puzzle he had encountered all year? Will you be requiring further combat with the window treatments, my lady? Arthur asked, a distinct smirk now playing openly on his lips. Or shall we take our tea? I swallowed hard, clutching his handkerchief like a lifeline. The original plot was entirely dead. But as I looked at the Duke's surprisingly charming smile, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this absurd new narrative might be exactly what I needed to keep my head attached to my neck. Chapter 3. The journey from the primary drawing room to the sunlit conservatory felt less like a leisurely morning stroll, and more like a forced march to the gallows. Arthur offered me his arm, and I took it with all the enthusiasm of a woman grabbing a live electrical wire. Through the thick wool of his charcoal sleeve, I could feel the rigid, unyielding muscle of the man I had systematically tortured for 19 chapters. We entered the conservatory, a sprawling glass and iron architectural marvel that I had explicitly designed to reflect the suffocating, oppressive nature of high society. At the time of writing, I thought the metaphor of exotic, trapped orchids was incredibly profound. In reality, it was just violently humid. My corset immediately began to act like a thermal trap, cooking my internal organs at a slow, agonizing simmer. Arthur held out a wrought iron chair, and I sank into it, my skirts billowing around me like a lavender silk parachute. A terrified footman immediately wheeled over a 3-tiered silver cart laden with Earl Grey tea, cucumber sandwiches cut with geometric precision, and scones piled high with clotted cream. I reached for a scone, desperate to stress eat, when the air in front of my face shimmered violently. System alert, proximity warning, incoming plot device. I froze, the scone halfway to my mouth. The original female lead, Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, has entered the estate. Objective: assert your dominance as the villainess. Deliver a scathing, unforgettable insult to shatter her confidence. Penalty for failure: the Duke will realize you are incompetent, abandon you, and your execution will proceed as scheduled. You have got to be kidding me, I muttered under my breath, dropping the scone back onto the china plate. I assure you, I am entirely serious, Arthur said smoothly, pouring himself a cup of tea. He raised a dark, perfectly sculpted brow. The Earl Grey is imported directly from the finest estates in India. Though if you prefer a different blend, I can have the staff fetch it. Before I could frantically explain that I wasn't talking to him, the glass doors of the conservatory swung open. A collective gasp seemed to echo from the very flora itself. Standing in the threshold was a vision of absolute, untouchable perfection. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft. She possessed cascading locks of spun gold, eyes the color of a clear summer sky, and a complexion so impossibly luminous, she appeared to be heavily filtered by a professional photography app. She was wearing a delicate, pastel pink day dress that hugged her modest curves without a single wrinkle. I hated her immediately. Not because she was beautiful, but because writing her dialogue had always been agonizingly easy, whereas writing Victoria's had required 3 cups of coffee and a thesaurus. Your Grace, Eleanor breathed, her voice a melodic, gentle chime that made me want to instantly swallow a spoonful of dry cinnamon. She curtsied deeply, a picture of flawless grace. I apologize for intruding. The Duchess Dowager invited me to view the blooming orchids. Her gaze shifted to me, and her massive, doe-like eyes widened in practiced, innocent terror. Lady Victoria, I did not realize you were calling upon the Duke today. The golden quill materialized and aggressively tapped my forehead, an action that felt like a localized static shock. Prompt, engage. Destroy her self-esteem. Call her a scheming, opportunistic social climber masquerading as a saint. Use your legendary razor-sharp wit. Go. My razor-sharp wit? My mind frantically booted up, searching the archives of my brain for a cutting remark. Come on, Penelope, I thought to myself. You are a best-selling author. You write dialogue for a living. String words together. Make them hurt. Make them sparkle with venom. I stood up slowly, attempting to tower over her. The effect was somewhat ruined by the sheer weight of my skirts, which required me to plant my feet firmly apart like a sumo wrestler just to maintain balance. Well, I drawled, narrowing my crimson eyes. I took a deep breath, preparing to unleash a monologue of pure, unadulterated villainy. If it isn't Lady Eleanor. And then nothing. Absolute, deafening silence filled my brain. The writer's block that had plagued me in my apartment slammed into my consciousness with the force of a runaway freight train. The vocabulary centers of my brain simply shut down. I couldn't remember words. I couldn't remember syntax. I couldn't even remember how to construct a basic, coherent sentence. Eleanor shrank back, tears already shimmering beautifully in her eyes. My lady, she whispered, trembling like a delicate leaf in a hurricane. System, what are you waiting for? Insult her. Go after the dress. Tell her she looks like a cheap, discarded pastry. Ich zerrte her pink dress. My brain grasped desperately at straws. Your dress, I began, my voice booming slightly louder than intended. Eleanor flinched. Arthur paused, his teacup hovering inches from his lips, his icy blue eyes fixed intently on my face. I pointed a dramatic, trembling finger at Eleanor's flawless ensemble. Your dress, I repeated, my mind completely flatlining. I tried to think of the word for tacky. Or derivative. Or literally anything negative. Is. Very. The silence stretched. A bead of sweat rolled down my corset-strangled spine. It is very fabric. I finished lamely, dropping my hand to my side. The entire conservatory descended into a stunned, absolute quiet. A singular cricket chirped from a potted fern in the corner. Eleanor blinked, a single, crystalline tear rolling down her rosy cheek. She looked deeply, profoundly confused. Ah yes, my lady, she stammered softly, wiping at her eye. It is constructed of silk. I wanted to die. Truly, the guillotine in chapter 21 suddenly seemed like a sweet, merciful release compared to this agonizing social failure. I had just delivered the least effective, most incredibly stupid insult in the history of British aristocratic society. I slowly sank back into my floral wrought iron chair, burying my face in my gloved hands. System, 50 to villainous reputation. Plus 100 to utter stupidity. That was arguably the most embarrassing string of syllables ever uttered by a human being. I am officially embarrassed to be hosting you. Suddenly a low, rich sound vibrated through the humid air. I peeked through my fingers to see Duke Arthur Pendleton resting his teacup on the saucer. His broad shoulders were shaking. He was looking directly at me, his icy eyes practically glowing with undeniable mirth. A keen observation, Lady Victoria, Arthur said, his deep voice thick with barely suppressed laughter. And remarkably astute. Lady Eleanor's dress is, indeed, exceptionally fabric-like in its construction. Eleanor looked wildly between the two of us, entirely lost. The golden quill zipped into my vision, its font shifting to a blinding, chaotic neon green. Thing. System update. Plus 20 affection points from the Duke. Host, I have no idea how you are doing this, but he seems to find your severe cognitive decline utterly charming. Keep failing upward. Chapter 4. The stifling humidity of the glass conservatory eventually became too much even for the seemingly unflappable Duke. At his suggestion, our incredibly awkward trio relocated to the sprawling, impeccably manicured outdoor gardens of the Blackwood estate. Walking beside them felt like a masterclass in severe inadequacy. Lady Eleanor practically floated over the crushed gravel paths, her pastel pink skirts gliding with an ethereal, weightless grace. Duke Arthur walked with the crisp, commanding stride of a man who owned not just the land beneath his expensive leather boots, but the very concept of walking itself. I, on the other hand, was lumbering along like a heavily armored lavender tank. My corset dug viciously into my ribs with every step, and the massive bustle at the rear of my dress felt like dragging a small, well-upholstered piece of furniture behind me. I was sweating, I was out of breath, and I was desperately trying to remember the geography of the gardens I had personally invented. The roses are simply breathtaking this season, Your Grace, Eleanor murmured, pausing delicately beside a massive, overflowing trellis of vibrant red blooms. She reached out with a gloved hand, gently cradling a velvet petal. She looked like an oil painting. She looked like the cover of every romance novel I had ever desperately tried to emulate. Arthur stopped beside her, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the gravel path. Indeed, he replied, his tone polite but entirely devoid of the warmth he had surprisingly shown me earlier. He clasped his hands behind his back, his broad shoulders shifting beneath his tailored charcoal morning coat. The head gardener takes immense pride in this particular hybrid. I hovered awkwardly a few paces behind them, intensely focused on not rolling an ankle in my rigid-heeled boots. Suddenly, the air directly in front of my face began to shimmer and distort. The golden quill zipped into existence, glowing with a renewed, menacing intensity. System alert. Prime opportunity detected. Main quest task. Execute a classic villainous sabotage maneuver. The heroine is standing precariously close to the thorny rose bushes. Trip her into the foliage to establish your dominance and cruel nature. Goal. Assert territorial superiority. Penalty for failure. The Duke's intrigue will fade, the plot will reset, and your impending execution will be firmly locked into the timeline. I stared at the floating red text, a knot of absolute dread tightening in my already heavily restricted stomach. Trip her? Are you out of your digital mind? I screamed internally. I can barely manage my own center of gravity, let alone orchestrate a tactical, calculated assault. Host, it is a simple trip. Extend the lower appendage, obstruct her pathway, and let gravity do the rest. Do not overcomplicate basic physics. You have 30 seconds before they move on. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I looked at Eleanor, who was innocently admiring a particularly large bloom, and then at Arthur, who was staring out across the rolling green lawns. I had to do it. If I didn't act out the role of the villainess, the system would abandon me to the guillotine. I took a deep, shuddering breath, attempting to channel the cruel, calculating Lady Victoria I had spent months writing. I fixed a manufactured sneer onto my face and took a wide, determined step forward, intending to subtly slide my foot directly behind Eleanor's delicate satin slipper. However, my brain, riddled with writer's block and panic, entirely failed to calculate the sheer, staggering volume of my own garments. As I aggressively swung my leg forward to execute the trip, the toe of my heavy leather boot caught securely in the thick, ruffled hem of my own lavender silk skirt. The immediate loss of momentum was catastrophic. Instead of smoothly sweeping Eleanor's leg out from under her, I effectively tied my own ankles together. Time seemed to slow to an excruciating, agonizing crawl. I pitched forward, my arms pinwheeling wildly in the air like a deranged windmill. I bypassed Eleanor entirely, flying past her shoulder with a completely undignified squawk. Good heavens! Eleanor shrieked, pressing her hands to her cheeks. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, bone-crushing impact with the mercilessly hard gravel path. I was about to become the first villainess in literary history to die from a self-inflicted trip before Chapter 20. But the brutal impact never came. Instead, a blur of charcoal wool moved with terrifying, impossible speed. Two incredibly strong, solid arms wrapped firmly around my heavily corseted waist, halting my disastrous descent with astonishing ease. The momentum swung me around, and my hands instinctively flew up, flattening desperately against a broad, solid chest. I snapped my eyes open, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I was entirely suspended, held firmly against Duke Arthur Pendleton. His face was mere inches from mine. I could see the faint, distinguished shadow of stubble along his razor-sharp jawline. I could see the individual, stormy flecks of gray within his icy blue eyes. His signature scent of sandalwood and crisp winter air enveloped me entirely. It was objectively the most intensely romantic, exquisitely framed moment I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was the exact, trope-heavy scenario I deployed in my novels when I wanted my readers to swoon. And because my brain was completely fried, and my writer's block had utterly decimated my ability to function as a normal human being, I reacted in the worst way possible. I stared directly into the smoldering, intense eyes of the man holding me, panicked entirely, and yelled at the top of my lungs. Unhand me, you devastatingly handsome plot device. The words echoed loudly across the manicured gardens, bouncing off the ancient stone walls of the estate, and sending a flock of startled doves scattering into the blue sky. Eleanor gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Arthur froze. For 3 agonizingly long seconds he simply stared down at me, his strong arms still locked securely around my waist. The intense, brooding expression on his face slowly cracked. His lips parted slightly, and then to my absolute horror, he threw his head back and let out a genuine, unrestrained bark of laughter. It was a rich, booming sound that completely shattered his icy persona. The golden quill zipped frantically around our heads, glowing a blinding, euphoric green. Bing. System update. Plus 30 affection points from Duke Arthur Pendleton. Task failed successfully. Host, you are an absolute train wreck, but he appears to be fully investing in a ticket for the ride. Please continue to aggressively malfunction. Chapter 5. The rich, booming sound of Duke Arthur's laughter completely shattered the tranquil, heavily manufactured atmosphere of the manicured gardens. It was a magnificent, chest-rumbling sound that seemed to fundamentally alter the molecular structure of the air around us. I remained frozen against his solid chest for a few excruciating seconds, my face burning with the heat of 1,000 dying suns. Slowly, with an agonizingly deliberate gentleness, he lowered my feet back onto the crushed white gravel path. He did not immediately step away. His large, gloved hands lingered on my waist, a heavy, grounding weight against the rigid silk and unforgiving steel boning of my corset. His icy blue eyes, usually so guarded and severe in my original manuscript, were crinkled at the corners, sparkling with a profound, unadulterated amusement that I had quite literally never written into his character profile. A plot device, am I? Arthur murmured, his voice dropping a full octave, practically purring the words into the space between us. The sheer proximity of his devastatingly handsome face short-circuited whatever remaining brain cells I possessed. I must confess, Lady Victoria, I have been called many dreadful things in my tenure as Duke, but never a plot device. Is this a new, avant-garde term of endearment amongst the ton? I slapped my hands over my burning cheeks, desperately taking a stumbling step backward. It was a bout of momentary delirium. I squeaked, my voice cracking humiliatingly in the quiet garden. The corset restricts the oxygen flow to my frontal lobe. I am not legally responsible for the words that exit my mouth today. A few paces away, Lady Eleanor cleared her throat delicately. She was clutching her pastel pink skirts, looking between the two of us as if we had both suddenly sprouted a second head. The original plot dictated that she and the Duke should be exchanging lingering, star-crossed glances by the rare roses right now. Instead, she looked deeply uncomfortable, like an accidental intruder crashing a highly bizarre, incredibly private joke. I believe I should take my leave. Eleanor stammered softly, executing a hurried, slightly wobbly curtsy. My aunt will be wondering where I have absconded to. Thank you for the tour of the grounds, Your Grace. Good day, Lady Victoria. Without waiting for a response, the delicate heroine of my novel spun on her satin heels and practically sprinted away down the gravel path, fleeing the scene of my spectacular social implosion. Arthur watched her go, entirely unbothered by her abrupt departure. He turned his attention back to me, offering his arm once again with a flawless, sweeping motion. Shall we return to the conservatory, my devastatingly handsome lady? Your Earl Grey tea is likely growing cold. I took his arm, my brain flatlining entirely. I had successfully chased off the heroine, completely derailed the emotional climax of the chapter, and somehow managed to make the brooding Duke actively flirt with me. Once we were seated back in the stifling, humid conservatory, the golden quill materialized above the silver tea service, glowing with an angry, pulsating crimson light. The cheerful green font from my previous failure had vanished, replaced by an urgent, flashing red block of text that hurt my eyes. System alert. Critical plot deviation detected. Host, while your comedic timing is accidentally impeccable, you are aggressively derailing the narrative genre. This is a romance novel, not a vaudeville comedy routine. The romantic tension quota is dangerously low. I glared at the floating text while Arthur calmly poured himself a fresh cup of tea. What do you want from me? I muttered under my breath. Main quest task. Execute a deliberate, genuine romantic gesture within the next 5 minutes. Do not trip. Do not sneeze. Do not yell about plot devices. Prove you are capable of functioning within the romance genre. Penalty for failure. Total spontaneous baldness. My jaw dropped. I choked on a gasp, my hands instinctively flying up to clutch my meticulously styled, cascading raven curls. Baldness. I hissed vehemently into the empty air. You wouldn't dare. Arthur paused, the silver teapot hovering precariously over his porcelain cup. He looked at me, then looked at the empty space I was currently threatening with extreme prejudice. Lady Victoria? Are you warring with the invisible atmospheric dust once more? No, I squeaked, dropping my hands into my lap and forcing a manic, terrified smile onto my face. Just contemplating the fleeting nature of physical beauty, Your Grace. System. 4 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. Tick-tock host. Your scalp is on the line. I stared at the Duke in absolute panic. A deliberate romantic gesture. I had to do something undeniably romantic right now. I furiously scoured my empty brain for a usable trope. A lingering touch? No, he was sitting across a wide wrought iron table. A poetic compliment? I couldn't remember a single line of poetry that didn't involve tragic death or utter despair. My eyes frantically darted around the table and landed on the 3-tiered silver pastry cart. Food. Feeding someone was a classic, intimate romance trope, wasn't it? A delicate, sensual sharing of a ripe strawberry or a delicate bite of cake. Unfortunately, there were no strawberries. There were only massive, heavily baked, incredibly dense scones. System. 2 minutes remaining. Prepare for the ultimate follicle purge. Desperation seized my limbs. I grabbed the largest, driest-looking scone from the bottom tier of the cart. I didn't bother with the strawberry jam or the clotted cream. I simply leaned aggressively across the small table, my corset groaning in loud protest, and thrust the baked good directly toward Arthur's face. Eat this, I blurted out, my voice laced with sheer panic. Arthur froze. The large scone was hovering less than an inch from his aristocratic nose. I had basically weaponized a pastry in the name of romance. I beg your pardon? He asked softly, his eyes flicking from the scone to my wildly unhinged expression. It is a gesture, I insisted loudly, my arm trembling as I held the scone steady. A romantic gesture. I am feeding you, because I deeply care about your nutritional intake. Now please, for the love of everything holy, take a bite before my hair falls out. Silence descended upon the humid conservatory once more. I waited for him to slap my hand away. I waited for him to finally summon his guards and have me dragged away to the asylum for attempting to suffocate him with dry baked goods. Instead, Arthur Pendleton, the most feared and respected duke in the realm, leaned forward. He didn't break eye contact with me for a single second. His gaze was dark, intense, and utterly unreadable as he closed his lips over the edge of the scone. He took a slow, deliberate bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes locked onto mine with a smoldering intensity that sent a sudden, genuine wave of heat rushing straight to my cheeks. The sheer absurdity of the situation faded, replaced by an electric, heavy tension that made my breath catch in my throat. The golden quill zoomed rapidly between us, practically bursting like a festive firework. Ding. System update. Task completed. Romantic tension quota fulfilled. Hair follicles miraculously secured. Plus 40 affection points from Duke Arthur Pendleton. System note. I am utterly baffled, host. It was the most aggressive, terrifying romantic gesture in recorded history, and yet, he is completely captivated by you. You are a terrifying genius. Chapter 6. The heavy, stifling humidity of the Grand Glass Conservatory felt entirely secondary to the sudden, suffocating wave of pure romantic tension radiating from across the small, wrought iron table. Duke Arthur Pendleton had just taken a deliberate, unblinking bite out of the incredibly dry, jam-less scone I had aggressively shoved into his personal space to save my hair follicles from the system's wrath. And he was still chewing. Slowly. Methodically. He didn't look away. His icy blue eyes, the very same eyes I had spent literal hours describing as unyielding glaciers of desolate sorrow, in my first draft, were locked onto mine with a burning intensity that made my toes curl inside my rigid, thoroughly uncomfortable leather boots. It wasn't the glare of a man who was offended by my appalling lack of etiquette. It was the look of a predator who had just discovered a fascinating, highly volatile new prey. I slowly withdrew my trembling hand, dropping the crumbly remainder of the ruined pastry back onto the silver tier. My heart was hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against the unforgiving steel boning of my corset. I swallowed audibly in the quiet room. "I trust it was to your liking, Your Grace?" I managed to squeak out, my voice sounding painfully thin and reedy in the damp, floral-scented air. Arthur finally broke eye contact, just for a fraction of a second, to swallow the dry pastry. He smoothly retrieved his monogrammed linen handkerchief, the very same handkerchief he had graciously offered me after the disastrous sneeze incident in the drawing room, and delicately dabbed at the corner of his perfectly sculpted mouth. "It was exceptionally dry, Lady Victoria," he replied, his deep, resonant baritone rumbling with that terrifying, newfound amusement, and utterly devoid of clotted cream or preserves. However, the incredibly passionate delivery of the baked good more than compensated for its obvious culinary shortcomings. I slumped back in my floral wrought iron chair, staring at him in utter bewilderment. My brain frantically tried to parse this bizarre interaction through the established lens of my original manuscript. Duke Arthur was supposed to be a man who prized quiet elegance, subservient grace, and gentle, unwavering fragility. He was supposed to fall head over heels in love with Lady Eleanor precisely because she was a delicate, weeping flower who constantly needed rescuing from minor social inconveniences. I had explicitly, painstakingly written him to be deeply repulsed by loud, aggressive, or unhinged behavior from the aristocracy. So why was he looking at me like I was the most thrilling, captivating thing he had ever encountered in his entire life? Was the man a closet masochist? Had my incredibly poor pacing, copious plot holes, and rushed deadlines fundamentally broken his psychological programming? Right on cue, the golden quill materialized above the silver tea service, twirling in the air with smug, obnoxious digital energy. System analysis, evaluating male lead's psychological profile. Result: the Duke is currently experiencing severe delicate flower fatigue. He has been surrounded by boring, weeping, fragile aristocrats for his entire adult life. Your sudden, violent unpredictability and utter lack of social grace is directly triggering his long-dormant adrenaline receptors. Congratulations, host. You accidentally created a man who craves absolute chaos, and you are a walking, talking natural disaster. I wanted to furiously argue with the glowing text, to vehemently defend my intricate character arcs and nuanced world-building skills, but the system's blunt assessment made a terrifying, undeniable amount of sense. Arthur leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on the delicate wrought iron table. The physical proximity was suddenly overwhelming. He was so large, so imposing, and yet his posture was entirely relaxed, open, and dangerously inviting. "You are remarkably quiet all of a sudden, my lady," Arthur observed smoothly, his gaze dropping momentarily to my lips before returning to my wide eyes. "Is the invisible atmospheric dust troubling your delicate constitution once more? Or are you perhaps plotting another vicious culinary assault?" "I am simply recalibrating my expectations of this afternoon, Your Grace," I stammered, frantically trying to regain some semblance of my villainous composure. I sat up straighter, wincing as the rigid corset dug ruthlessly into my lower ribs. I had confidently assumed a man of your esteemed stature would find my recent conduct deeply improper and thoroughly reprehensible. Arthur chuckled again. I was never, ever going to get used to that sound. It did entirely unfair, completely unscripted things to my stomach. Improper? Perhaps by the rigid, suffocating standards of the ton, Arthur conceded, casually waving a large, gloved hand dismissively. Reprehensible? Hardly. I find the endless parade of polite, simpering ladies and predictable conversations to be a highly effective cure for insomnia. You, Lady Victoria, are many perplexing things today, but you are blessedly, delightfully unpredictable. He reached across the small distance between us. I froze, my breath catching painfully in my throat, as his large, warm hand hovered near my face. With an agonizingly slow, gentle motion, he brushed an imaginary crumb from the corner of my mouth. His thumb lingered for just a fraction of a second against my lower lip. The touch sent a jolt of pure, crackling electricity straight down my heavily corseted spine. You are entirely unlike the other ladies of society, Arthur whispered, the sarcastic edge bleeding completely out of his voice, leaving behind a raw, intense sincerity that completely terrified me. And I find I am eagerly anticipating whatever catastrophic social faux pas you will commit next. I couldn't speak. My extensive vocabulary had entirely abandoned me. I, Penelope Scratch, a professional best-selling writer of romance, was being successfully romanced by my own fictional character, and I had absolutely no idea how to write myself out of the corner. System alert. Affection level reaching critical mass. Host is in grave danger of falling in love with her own plot device. I highly recommend shifting focus to the main quest before you forget you are legally scheduled to be decapitated in exactly 13 days. The glowing green text served as a brutally effective bucket of ice water. Right. The beheading. The execution. The public humiliation and agonizing, highly publicized death. I cleared my throat loudly, forcing myself to lean back against the iron chair and break the intoxicating physical proximity. I must apologize, Your Grace, but I fear the oppressive humidity of this conservatory is finally taking its toll on my delicate sensibilities. I must retire to my private chambers to rest and properly prepare for the royal ball tomorrow evening. Arthur withdrew his hand, a fleeting look of genuine disappointment crossing his sharp features, before he smoothly masked it with his usual stoic composure. He stood up immediately, his tall frame towering over the table, and offered a perfectly executed formal bow. Of course, Lady Victoria, he said smoothly, his eyes sparkling with a lingering, dangerous warmth. I shall eagerly await our dance at the royal ball. Do try your absolute best not to push anyone into the punch bowl before our waltz. As he turned and strode confidently out of the conservatory, leaving me entirely alone with my ruined scone and my racing heart, the system pulsed one final, mocking message in bright red letters. Objective updated. Survive the royal ball without accidentally poisoning yourself. Good luck, host. You're going to severely need it. Chapter 7. The royal ball was an architectural and sensory nightmare designed specifically to overwhelm the human nervous system. As my carriage pulled up to the grand, sweeping entrance of the royal palace, I stared out the window at the blindingly bright, opulent display of wealth, and immediately wanted to instruct the driver to turn around and take me back to bed. Thousands of floating, magically infused candles illuminated the massive, towering marble columns of the grand facade. The air was thick with the overpowering, cloying scent of expensive exotic perfumes, roasted meats, and palpable political desperation. My maid Betty had spent 4 agonizing hours wrestling me into my formal ball gown. If my day gown had been a lavender tank, this dress was a fully armored, crimson silk battleship. It featured a sweetheart neckline that was scandalously low, a skirt so incredibly wide it practically required its own dedicated zip code, and a heavily boned corset that had definitively rearranged my internal organs into a completely uncharted configuration. I was sparkling with enough diamond jewelry to easily blind a small flock of pigeons. As I stepped out of the carriage and joined the seemingly endless, churning sea of aristocrats flowing into the grand ballroom, the familiar, annoying chime echoed directly in my right ear. The golden quill zipped into existence, floating menacingly at my eye level. System alert. Main quest event triggered. Location: the royal ball. Current timeline: Chapter 13. Time until host's beheading: 12 days. Objective: execute the poison chalice trope. You must slip the provided vial of lethal nightshade into the Duke's wine goblet. This will establish your irreversible, treacherous nature and push the narrative forward. I stopped dead in my tracks, causing an elderly, highly decorated general behind me to crash directly into my massive bustle. I completely ignored his indignant spluttering and stared at the floating text in absolute horror. Poison him, I hissed vehemently under my breath, frantically waving my large feathered fan to cover my mouth from onlookers. Are you completely insane? I'm actively trying to avoid getting publicly beheaded, not speed run my way to the guillotine. Host, the plot rigidly demands dramatic tension. If you fail to initiate the poisoning sequence, the narrative will forcefully correct itself. A heavy crystal chandelier will simply crush you right now. The choice is yours. Poison the Duke, or become a crimson stain on the marble floor. The vial is currently secured discreetly in your cleavage. I gasped, looking down in panic. Sure enough, tucked securely between the heavily pushed-up real estate of my bodice, was a small, ornate glass vial filled with a shimmering, ominous purple liquid. I desperately wanted to scream, but the threat of a falling chandelier was a highly motivating factor. I navigated the crowded, deafeningly loud ballroom with the stiff grace of a terrified, heavily armored swan. My eyes frantically scanned the expansive room for my target. I found him standing near the grand, sweeping marble staircase. Duke Arthur Pendleton was a vision of absolute, unfair perfection. He wore a stark, impeccably tailored midnight blue evening coat with intricate silver embroidery that perfectly caught the candlelight. His raven hair was styled flawlessly, and his icy blue eyes were scanning the glittering crowd with a profound, terrifying boredom. He looked like a dark, brooding god trapped amidst a sea of pastel-colored mortals. I took a deep, shuddering breath, retrieved 2 crystal goblets of rich red wine from a passing footman's silver tray, and discreetly uncorked the vial with my thumb. I dumped the entire purple contents into the goblet in my right hand, swirling it gently to mix the liquid. Just hand it to him, I aggressively coached myself. Hand it to him, pretend to trip over your hem, and spill it before he actually drinks it. Genius. I marched up to him, pasting a brittle, terrifying smile onto my face. Your Grace, I chirped loudly, my voice cracking slightly under the intense pressure of impending murder. Arthur's severe expression instantly softened the exact moment he saw me. The profound boredom vanished, replaced entirely by that dangerous, thoroughly unscripted amusement. Lady Victoria, you are a devastatingly beautiful vision in crimson this evening. Are you preparing to assault someone with those dual goblets, or are they meant for consumption? One is for you, I said hurriedly, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I went to hand him the poisoned goblet in my right hand, but just as I extended my arm, a loud, booming voice echoed over the sprawling ballroom. His Royal Majesty the King. The entire room collectively gasped and seamlessly dropped into deep, synchronized bows and curtsies. Panic seized my brain. I dropped into a frantic, wobbly curtsy, my massive crimson skirt billowing up forcefully around me. In the chaotic, blinding rush of the movement, my hands crossed over my chest to steady my balance. When we rose back up to our feet, my brain had completely short-circuited. I looked at the crystal goblet in my left hand. I looked at the crystal goblet in my right hand. They looked exactly, identically red. Arthur smiled softly and smoothly plucked the goblet from my right hand. How exceptionally thoughtful of you, my lady. A toast to your radiant beauty. Wait, I panicked loudly. Had I handed him the poison? Or was the poison safely in my left hand? My lingering writer's block had completely obliterated my short-term memory. To stall him from drinking, I frantically brought the goblet in my left hand to my lips and aggressively downed half of it in one massive, entirely unladylike gulp. The wine was rich, heavy, and possessed a very distinct, strange metallic aftertaste. I froze instantly. The golden quill popped into existence between us, completely invisible to the Duke, who was currently taking a polite, small sip of his completely untainted wine. The quill scribbled furiously, the font pulsing a bright, chaotic yellow. System alert. Catastrophic host error detected. You just consumed the lethal nightshade. My eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror. I dropped the crystal goblet directly onto the marble floor. It shattered into 100 jagged pieces, splashing red wine across the polished white stone. Arthur immediately dropped his own glass, his large hands grabbing my shoulders firmly. Victoria? Good God, what is wrong? You are suddenly pale as a ghost. I'm dying, I wheezed pathetically, clutching my stomach with both hands. I just poisoned myself. Tell my editor I vehemently hate her. System update. Host, calm your dramatic hysterics. I altered the chemical formula. You are not going to die. It is not actual poison. It is just a highly concentrated, incredibly fast-acting, mild laxative. I strictly needed dramatic tension, not a fresh corpse. I stopped wheezing and stared at the floating yellow text. My blood ran completely cold. A loud, ominous, and distinct gurgle echoed from the very depths of my heavily corseted stomach. Victoria! Arthur demanded loudly, his icy eyes wide with genuine, uncharacteristic panic. He pulled me flush against his broad chest, his strong arm wrapping securely around my waist. Someone fetch the royal physician immediately. Stay with me, my precious love. I will not lose you. It was, without a doubt, the most incredibly romantic, devastatingly passionate thing he had ever said to me. He boldly called me my love. He was holding me like a precious, vital lifeline. The romantic tension was absolutely immaculate. And I desperately, urgently needed to locate a chamber pot before I ruined my own historical legacy forever. No fisischen. I squeaked wildly, pushing against his solid chest with the frantic, terrified strength of a trapped animal. I need to flee. I must flee this room immediately. I will absolutely not let you out of my sight. Arthur roared, completely abandoning his carefully crafted stoic persona. Before I could protest, he scooped me up into his powerful arms like a distressed bridal carry, entirely ignoring the heavy weight of my skirts. Put me down! I shrieked, kicking my leather boots wildly, my crimson silk skirts flying everywhere in a disastrous cloud. Arthur, I swear to all that is holy, if you do not put me down this exact second, our epic romance is going to end in a horrifying biological tragedy. The rest of the evening was an absolute unmitigated blur of chaotic panic, intense romantic confessions yelled down dimly lit palatial hallways, and me frantically barricading myself inside a lavish guest washroom. The most powerful, brooding duke in the realm spent 3 solid hours dramatically pounding on the heavy oak door, desperately begging me to let him save my fragile life, while I sat utterly mortified, fighting a humiliating, losing battle against the system's artificially manufactured digestive crisis. It was definitively the absolute worst night of my entire existence. This is an original story by Romancecravestories. If you see it uploaded on another channel, please report it to YouTube and let me know. Thank you for supporting original creators. Chapter 8. The morning following the catastrophic, biologically disastrous events of the royal ball, I refused to leave my bed. I pulled the heavy, velvet crimson comforter over my head and desperately prayed to whatever literary gods governed this absurd universe to let me spontaneously combust. I, Lady Victoria Blackwood, formerly known as Penelope Scratch, had survived the assassination attempt by my own system, but my social reputation was entirely, irrevocably deceased. I could only imagine the horrific, whispered gossip currently spreading through the drawing rooms of the ton. Did you hear? The fearsome Lady Victoria caught cholera in the middle of the king's toast, and barricaded herself in a guest washroom while the Duke of Blackwood wept against the doorframe. I groaned loudly, sinking deeper into the feather mattress. My lady, Betty's timid voice pierced my cocoon of misery. I felt the mattress dip slightly. I have brought your morning tea. And, the post has arrived. There is a rather urgent delivery from the Blackwood estate. I peeked out from under the comforter, my hair a tangled, chaotic bird's nest. Betty was standing there holding a silver tray laden with a steaming cup of chamomile tea and a massive, towering stack of thick parchment envelopes sealed with dark blue wax. How many are there? I croaked, my throat dry from yesterday's hysterics. 14, my lady, Betty whispered, her eyes wide with awe. They have been arriving by express courier every half hour since dawn. The Duke must be madly, passionately in love. I snatched the top letter from the pile, ripped open the heavy wax seal, and unfolded the thick parchment. I expected a formal inquiry into my health, perhaps a polite, thinly veiled suggestion that I seek quarantine at a rural sanitarium. Instead, my eyes assaulted the worst string of written words I had ever encountered in my professional career. My dearest, fragile Victoria. The moon wept silver tears upon the marble floor. As you fled my arms, locking that heavy oaken door, I paced the hall, a phantom trapped in dread's dark veil, listening to your agonizing, brave, and tragic wail. Return to me, my chaotic, unpredictable dove. For not even severe gastrointestinal distress can conquer true love. Yours in eternal devotion, Arthur. I stared at the parchment until the letters physically blurred together. It was a poem. He wrote me a poem. A terrible, agonizingly literal, rhyming poem about my bout of explosive diarrhea. System alert. New item acquired. The Duke's awful poetry X14. The golden quill zipped happily above my teacup, glowing a cheerful, mocking yellow. Host, I am in digital awe. You have completely broken his stoic programming. The brooding, emotionally unavailable male lead is now writing you medical-themed limericks. You are a pioneer of the romance genre. I am going to throw myself out the window, I announced flatly, tossing the parchment onto the floor. I couldn't stay in the house. The courier was bound to arrive with a 15th poem detailing my miraculous recovery through the medium of interpretive verse. After allowing Betty to lace me into a comparatively simple, meaning it only weighed 40 pounds, mint green walking dress, I fled the manor and practically sprinted toward the expansive, overgrown labyrinth of the estate's private gardens. I needed isolation. I needed peace. I needed to figure out how to reset this completely deranged timeline before I died of sheer, unadulterated embarrassment. I found a secluded, weathered stone bench hidden behind a massive wall of untamed ivy and collapsed onto it, gasping for breath against my corset. Why me? I whispered to the empty garden. I just wanted to write a best-selling tragedy and pay off my student loans. Lady Victoria? The soft melodic and entirely unwelcome chime of a voice snapped my head up. Standing at the entrance of the Ivy Enclave was Lady Eleanor Ashcroft. As always, she looked like a walking, talking oil painting. She wore a delicate, pale yellow muslin dress that somehow remained entirely unwrinkled despite the outdoor elements. The sunlight caught her spun gold hair perfectly, framing her angelic face in a soft, ethereal halo. But something was terribly wrong with the picture. Her massive, sky-blue eyes were rimmed with red. Her lower lip was trembling violently. She took a shaky step forward, clutching a pristine lace handkerchief to her chest. I followed you from the manor. I bribed your gardener to tell me where you went.
Ich zerrte her, utterly bewildered.
Eleanor? Are you crying? That was all it took. The heroine of my novel burst into perfectly aesthetic, sparkling tears. She didn't ugly cry. She wept with the poised, devastating beauty of a wounded swan. She rushed forward and dropped to her knees on the somewhat muddy grass, right in front of my stone bench. Why are you doing this? Eleanor cried, her voice cracking with pure dramatic anguish. Why are you stealing my duke? My brain stalled out. I blinked down at the beautiful, weeping heroine at my feet. The golden quill materialized instantly, hovering just out of Eleanor's line of sight, aggressively flashing a glowing red prompt. Main quest opportunity. The heroine is vulnerable. Crush her spirit. Tell her the duke prefers a woman with true fire and passion. Solidify your villainous triumph. I completely ignored the floating text. I leaned forward, my heavy skirts rustling loudly, and reached out. I didn't slap her. I didn't sneer. Instead, I grabbed Eleanor firmly by both of her delicate, trembling shoulders and looked deeply, desperately into her tear-filled eyes. Eleanor, listen to me. I pleaded, my voice thick with sheer, undeniable panic. I am not stealing him. You can have him. In fact, I am formally, legally transferring ownership of the Duke to you, effective immediately. Eleanor stopped crying. She sniffled softly, looking at me as if I had suddenly spoken to her in fluent ancient Greek. I beg your pardon. Take him, I yelled, giving her shoulders a frantic, gentle shake. Please, I am begging you to take him away from me. The man is completely broken. He won't stop reciting terrible, medical-themed poetry at me. He stood outside a washroom door for 3 hours last night composing a sonnet about my digestion. You are the delicate heroine. You are supposed to fix his dark, brooding soul. Please step up and do your job. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She looked utterly terrified. I do not understand, she whispered. He is the most eligible bachelor in the realm. He is handsome, wealthy, and powerful. He is a lunatic. I insisted wildly. Before I could further elaborate on the Duke's sudden descent into absolute madness, the heavy sound of a booted footstep crunched on the gravel path, just behind the ivy wall. Victoria? My love, are you hiding in the foliage again? The deep, booming baritone of Duke Arthur Pendleton echoed through the garden. Eleanor gasped and scrambled up from the muddy ground, frantically dabbing at her eyes and smoothing her ruined skirts. I froze on the stone bench, my heart sinking directly into my leather boots. Arthur rounded the corner of the ivy wall, looking devastatingly handsome in a casual, open-collared linen shirt and dark riding trousers. The wind artfully swept his raven hair across his forehead. He stopped in his tracks, his icy blue eyes assessing the scene. Eleanor with tear-stained cheeks, and me looking like a panicked mint-green gargoyle. He didn't even acknowledge the heroine. His gaze locked entirely onto me. Slowly, Arthur brought his right hand out from behind his back. He was holding a large, leafy, incredibly dirty bouquet. But there were no roses. There were no lilies. Arthur was proudly holding a massive, freshly uprooted bouquet of raw, purple turnips. The silence in the garden was absolute. I passed the kitchen gardens on my frantic search for you, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, impossibly earnest rumble as he stepped over to my bench. He completely ignored Eleanor's horrified gasp. He knelt down on one knee, right in the mud, offering the dirty root vegetables to me with the solemn reverence of a man presenting a priceless diamond. The gardener tried to offer me orchids, Arthur whispered, his eyes blazing with intense, unyielding devotion. But I saw these, and I knew they were the only tribute worthy of you today. They are earthy. They are chaotic. They have an aggressively thick skin. He smiled, a genuine, heartbreakingly gorgeous smile. They matched your sparkling eyes perfectly. I stared at the dirty turnips. I stared at the devastatingly handsome, incredibly powerful Duke kneeling in the mud. I stared at the weeping, thoroughly confused heroine standing 3 feet away. System update. The golden quill zipped violently through the air, flashing a bright, pulsing neon pink. Affection points maxed out. Genre officially shifted from romantic tragedy to unhinged agricultural comedy. Host, I am so sorry. You are going to marry this idiot. Chapter 9. The heavy, oppressive silence in the secluded garden was broken only by the gentle rustling of the ancient ivy and the distant, confused chirping of a single songbird. I stared down at the large, impossibly dirty bouquet of purple turnips. Clumps of dark, damp topsoil clung aggressively to the thick, fibrous roots, raining a steady drizzle of mud onto Duke Arthur's immaculate, perfectly polished leather riding boots. He was kneeling. The most powerful, formidable man in the realm, a man whose mere glare could allegedly topple small governments, was currently kneeling in the mud of a flower bed, gazing up at me with an expression of such raw, unadulterated adoration that my lungs completely forgot how to process oxygen. To my left, Lady Eleanor let out a faint, strangled squeak. She looked like a woman who had just witnessed the sky turn green and start raining teacups. The delicate heroine swayed unsteadily on her feet, clutching her pristine lace handkerchief to her pale lips. Your Grace, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. Those are root vegetables. Arthur didn't even blink. He didn't turn his head. His icy blue eyes, now melted into a warm, stormy, devastatingly intense sea of gray and blue, remained entirely fixed on my face. They are magnificent, Arthur corrected her softly, his deep voice rumbling with quiet, unyielding conviction. They are robust. They thrive in the dark, they weather the harshest of seasons, and they possess a hidden, spicy bite. They are the only fitting tribute for a woman of Lady Victoria's extraordinary, delightfully chaotic substance. I felt a sudden, profound tightness in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the rigid steel boning of my corset. The golden quill zipped erratically around Arthur's raven hair, leaving a trail of blinding, celebratory pink sparkles in its wake. System update. Emotional resonance achieving critical. Massachusetts host, I must confess, this is wildly out of character for the male lead, but the narrative metrics are skyrocketing. The readers absolutely love the turnips. Take the vegetables. My trembling hands reached out on pure instinct. I bypassed the delicate, imaginary roses I had originally written into this scene, and wrapped my silk-gloved fingers around the thick, leafy, incredibly dirty green stalks. The sheer weight of the vegetables was surprisingly heavy. As I took the bouquet, my fingers brushed against Arthur's strong, warm hand. Another jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm, completely short-circuiting the remaining vestiges of my panic. I accept your tribute, Arthur, I murmured, clutching the turnips tightly against my mint green walking dress, entirely uncaring that the dark mud was aggressively staining the expensive silk. Arthur's breathtaking smile widened. He rose gracefully to his feet, seemingly oblivious to the dark, wet stain of mud coating the knee of his trousers. Eleanor could not take it anymore. The pure, unfiltered absurdity of the situation finally broke her delicate heroine programming. She let out a loud, hysterical sob, spun around on her delicate heels, and sprinted away down the gravel path, fleeing the garden as if pursued by a pack of rabid wolves. We were completely alone. Arthur stepped closer, invading my personal space with that familiar, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and crisp winter air. He reached out, gently tucking a stray, wind-blown curl behind my ear. You look beautiful when you are completely baffled, my love, he whispered. I looked into his eyes, and suddenly, the massive, impenetrable wall of my writer's block shattered into a million tiny, glowing pieces. The profound, agonizing paralysis that had plagued me for the last 3 days wasn't because I didn't know how to write the story. It wasn't because I lacked the vocabulary or the thematic vision. It was because deep down in the core of my creative soul, I fundamentally hated the original ending I had mapped out. I didn't want this magnificent, unhinged, turnip-wielding man to die in Chapter 20. I didn't want him to fall off a horse and break his neck in a contrived, deeply unoriginal tragedy designed purely for cheap tears. I wanted him to live. I wanted to see what other ridiculous vegetables he would present to me. I wanted to argue with him over breakfast and accidentally destroy more of his expensive cravats. I wanted a romantic comedy. A fierce, undeniable wave of determination washed over me. I wasn't just a transmigrated victim of my own plot anymore. I was Penelope Scratch, a best-selling author, and I was going to seize control of my own narrative. I glared fiercely at the floating golden quill. "Give me that," I snapped, reaching out and physically snatching the glowing, translucent quill out of the thin air. The system immediately flashed a frantic, panicked red. "Warning! Host, you are not authorized to directly handle the narrative interface. Put the quill down immediately. This is a severe violation of interdimensional literary protocols." I ignored it entirely. I marched over to the weathered stone bench, holding the heavy bouquet of turnips in my left hand and the glowing quill in my right. "Chapter 20, I commanded aloud, my voice ringing with newfound absolute authority. "Bring up the draft for Chapter 20. A large, glowing holographic parchment materialized in the air in front of me, covered in my own tight, familiar handwriting. It detailed the agonizing, highly emotional scene where Arthur's horse was startled by a snake, resulting in a fatal fall. I aggressively slashed the golden quill through the glowing text. A thick, burning line of bright red ink crossed out the entire page. "No," I declared fiercely. "Arthur does not go riding on that Tuesday. In fact, Arthur does not own that specific horse. He is perfectly safe." "Error! Error!" the system shrieked, flashing blinding strobe lights of red and yellow. "Host, you cannot simply erase the primary inciting incident for the tragic climax. The plot requires stakes. It requires suffering. If you remove the death scene, there is no dramatic tension." I spun around to face Arthur, who was watching me argue with the invisible air with an expression of deep, affectionate fascination. "Arthur," I said breathlessly, dropping the quill back into the ether, "do you enjoy horseback riding?" "I tolerate it," he replied smoothly, taking a step toward me, "though I find I much prefer standing exactly where I am right now." "Excellent," I said, a massive, unburdened smile breaking across my face. I looked back at the space where the system hovered. "There is your revision. No horses. We will find our dramatic tension elsewhere. Perhaps we will host a remarkably disastrous dinner party. Or perhaps I will attempt to bake a pie." The system flickered, glowing a sullen, resigned blue. Calculating revised trajectory. Plot stakes lowered. Comedy metrics elevated. "Host, you are entirely ruining a literary masterpiece, but your survival rate has increased by 75%. Fine. We will proceed with the dinner party." I laughed, a genuine, unrestrained sound that echoed through the secluded garden. Arthur closed the remaining distance between us, his strong arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me firmly against his chest, completely trapping the bouquet of turnips between us. "You are entirely mad, Victoria," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were a mere breath away from mine. "And I am hopelessly, irrevocably captivated." For the first time since waking up in this heavily corseted nightmare, I didn't panic. I didn't sneeze, I didn't trip, and I didn't yell about plot devices. I simply leaned up, closed my eyes, and let the hero of my revised story kiss me perfectly amidst the smell of damp soil and root vegetables. Chapter 10. The kiss was, objectively speaking, a terrible idea. We were standing in a muddy flower bed. I was clutching a bouquet of massive, soil-covered root vegetables against my chest, and the fabric of my transmigrated reality was currently hanging by a fragile, brightly glowing digital thread. And yet, as Arthur's lips met mine, the entire world outside the secluded ivy walls ceased to exist. He tasted of expensive Earl Grey tea and the crisp scent of peppermint. His large hand rested warmly against the nape of my neck, his thumb tracing my jaw with a startling reverence. I dropped the heavy bouquet of turnips. They hit the soft mud with a highly unromantic thud, but neither of us broke apart. For a man I had explicitly written as an emotionally constipated fortress of solitude, the Duke of Blackwood was a devastatingly talented kisser. The sheer intensity made my knees buckle, forcing me to cling to his linen shirt just to remain upright. When we reluctantly parted, I was gasping for breath, my cheeks burning hotter than a Victorian hearth fire. Arthur rested his forehead against mine, a magnificent, triumphant smile playing across his sculpted lips. "Well," Arthur murmured, his deep baritone vibrating against my skin. "That was certainly a more effective remedy for atmospheric dust than my handkerchief." Before I could formulate a witty response, the air between us suddenly exploded with blinding strobe lights. System alert. Critical narrative instability. The golden quill zoomed between our faces, glowing an angry siren red. Host. While the romance metric is currently off the charts, the dramatic tension quota has completely bottomed out. By forcefully deleting the male lead's tragic equestrian death, you have created a massive genre vacuum. If a high-stakes dramatic climax is not achieved within the next hour, the timeline will forcefully reset, and you will be sent back to Chapter 1. I stumbled back, my romantic haze instantly evaporating into sheer panic. Back to Chapter 1? I gasped. Before the sneeze? I have to do all of this again. Victoria? Arthur asked, his brow furrowing as he watched me stare at the empty space above his shoulder. Has the dust returned? No, I said frantically. Arthur, how deeply do you value my physical safety? His eyes darkened instantly, his jaw setting into a hard line. With my life, I would burn this estate to the ground before I let a single hair on your head be harmed. Great. Keep that exact energy, I instructed wildly. I need to go forcefully create some dramatic tension. Do not follow me for exactly 3 minutes. And please, try to look devastated when you find me. I hiked up my mud-stained skirts and sprinted out of the garden. My boots pounded against the crushed white gravel as I searched the sprawling Blackwood estate for a suitable location for a fake tragedy. I needed something visually dramatic, sufficiently life-threatening in appearance, but practically harmless. My eyes locked onto the grand, sprawling decorative pond situated at the center of the hedge maze. In my manuscript, I had described the pond as a bottomless, dark abyss reflecting the tragic souls of the ancestors. It had an ornate stone bridge spanning its width, and the water was a deep, impenetrable shade of midnight blue. It was perfect. A dramatic, watery plunge. A fake drowning. A classic, high-stakes romance trope. I scrambled up the slick, moss-covered steps of the stone bridge. I waited exactly 3 minutes. When I saw the tall, broad-shouldered silhouette of Arthur rounding the corner of the maze, looking genuinely frantic, I took a deep breath. Woe is me, I yelled, projecting my voice across the gardens. The overwhelming burden of this cruel, tragic society is too much for my delicate soul to bear. Farewell, cruel world. Arthur froze, his eyes widening in absolute terror. Victoria. No. I squeezed my eyes shut, pinched my nose, and threw my body aggressively over the stone parapet. I braced myself for the freezing plunge into the dark abyss. I mentally prepared to hold my breath, sink into the depths, and let Arthur heroically dive in to rescue my limp, fading body. Splash. My heavy leather boots hit the bottom instantly. My knees bent with a sickening crunch of impact, and I slammed down into a thick, foul-smelling layer of squishy algae. I opened my eyes, coughing and sputtering. I wasn't drowning. I wasn't sinking into a bottomless abyss. I was sitting squarely on my bottom in the dead center of the pond, and the water was barely reaching my belly button. The impenetrable midnight blue color wasn't depth. It was just a massive, ungodly amount of decorative dye. I sat there in the 2-foot deep water, my heavy silk skirts ballooning around me like a massive, buoyant lily pad. A very large, highly offended orange koi fish swam directly up to my face, slapped my cheek with its wet tail, and darted away. I had never felt more utterly, completely defeated in my entire existence. Victoria. Arthur didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to remove his expensive jacket. He didn't take off his custom-made riding boots. He vaulted over the low stone wall of the pond and waded directly into the freezing, algae-filled water. The water barely reached his calves. He froze, looking down at his submerged boots, and then looked at me, sitting miserably in the mud. The raw terror on his handsome face melted away, replaced by that familiar, unbearable, soul-crushing amusement. System update. Dramatic tension quota. Technically fulfilled? The sheer pathetic nature of this fake suicide has thoroughly confused the algorithm. Proceeding with narrative. Arthur waded over to me, each step producing a loud, comical squelching sound. He didn't offer his hand to pull me up. Instead, He waded right into the deepest, muddiest part of the shallow water, completely ruining his trousers, and gracefully dropped to one knee right beside me. "Lady Victoria," Arthur murmured, his icy blue eyes dancing with vibrant, uncontainable joy as the cold water soaked into his clothes. He reached out, gently removing a wet leaf from my hair. "Your flair for the dramatic is truly unparalleled. Will you do me the profound honor of marrying me, so that we might be an absolute, unmitigated menace to high society together for the rest of our days?" I looked at the most powerful duke in the realm, kneeling in 2 feet of dyed fish water, looking at me like I was the most precious thing in the entire world. "Only if we serve turnips at the wedding," I sniffled. Arthur beamed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Chapter 11. The journey from the center of the decorative koi pond back to the imposing stone facade of the Blackwood Manor was arguably the least dignified march in the extensive, heavily documented history of the British aristocracy. I had officially accepted a marriage proposal while sitting in 2 feet of heavily dyed, aggressively blue water. Duke Arthur, a man whose fearsome reputation once commanded absolute silence in the House of Lords, was now wading through squishy algae with a triumphant, blinding smile plastered across his devastatingly handsome face. He stood up, the water cascading off his bespoke charcoal trousers in a cascading, muddy waterfall. He extended a large, dripping hand toward me. I took it, and with a single effortless tug, he hauled my soaking wet, corset-bound body out of the muck. My lavender silk skirt, which previously possessed the buoyancy of a majestic lily pad, now felt like a lead weight strapped securely to my waist. I must have weighed over 200 pounds in saturated fabric alone. As we squelched our way up the mossy stone steps of the bridge, the air between us suddenly violently crackled. The golden quill did not simply materialize. It exploded into existence with the frantic, chaotic energy of a festive firework trapped inside a tin can. It zoomed around our heads in erratic, jagged circles, leaving a blazing trail of neon, seizure-inducing strobe lights. Critical error 404. Genre not found. Narrative algorithm compromised. Fatal logic error detected. I squinted against the blinding glare. "Is it supposed to be sparking like that?" I muttered, wringing a gallon of dyed blue water out of my ruined skirts. "Is what sparking?" Arthur asked, pausing on the gravel path. He reached out and gently plucked a large, slimy green frond of algae from my shivering shoulder. He looked at me with an expression of such pure, unadulterated adoration that it made my heart violently stutter. He couldn't see the digital meltdown happening 3 inches from his aristocratic nose. Calculating. Romantic climax reached prematurely. Tragic tension, 0%. Comedic absurdity, 400%. System protocols overridden by sheer host incompetence. The glowing text suddenly glitched, turning a chaotic, pixelated rainbow of frantic colors.
Updating genre paramté.
Please stand by. Shifting from high-stakes gothic romance. Shifting to unhinged agricultural romantic comedy. I let out a wet, breathless laugh. "I think the universe has officially given up on trying to murder us, Arthur." He chuckled, a rich, deep sound that vibrated pleasantly in the humid afternoon air. He wrapped his soaking wet arm securely around my waist, pulling me flush against his side as we continued our squelching march toward the manor. If the universe had any sense at all, my love, it would know better than to stand between a man and his turnip-loving bride. We arrived at the grand, towering double oak doors of the manor, looking like a pair of swamp monsters who had recently raided a high-end boutique. The formidable Blackwood butler, a man named Higgins who possessed a spine made of pure, unyielding steel, swung the heavy doors open. He took one look at his esteemed master, the most powerful duke in the realm, covered head to toe in blue dye and pond scum, with a bright orange koi fish scale stuck to his razor-sharp jawline. Higgins did not bat a single eyelash. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." "Lady Victoria," Higgins intoned smoothly, executing a flawless, crisp bow. "Shall I instruct the kitchen staff to prepare a hot bath, or are you intending to continue your aquatic endeavors indoors?" "A bath will be wonderful, Higgins," Arthur replied cheerfully, leaving a large puddle of blue water on the pristine marble foyer. "And please send a courier to the royal jewelers immediately. I require their finest engagement ring. Something robust. Perhaps with a subtle root vegetable motif." Higgins simply bowed again. "Very good, Your Grace." An hour later, I was finally free of the wet, heavy corset. Betty had scrubbed me raw, muttering frantic prayers under her breath as she washed the stubborn blue dye out of my raven hair. Dressed in a thick, dry, obscenely comfortable cotton dressing gown, I sat by the roaring fireplace in my guest chambers, sipping a cup of steaming hot chocolate. The golden quill was hovering peacefully above the massive stone mantelpiece, its frantic glitching having finally subsided into a gentle, pulsating, pastel pink glow. System reboot successful. It wrote in the empty air, the font now a relaxed, flowing cursive script. New plot trajectory confirmed. You are no longer scheduled for a public decapitation. The guillotine has been officially dismantled and permanently removed from the narrative timeline. I let out a massive, shuddering breath I felt like I had been nervously holding for the last 4 agonizing days. I slumped back into the plush velvet armchair, happily closing my eyes. I had done it. I had successfully rewritten my own terrible tragedy and completely survived the dreaded Chapter 20 deadline, purely by weaponizing my own inherent clumsiness. However, the system chimed brightly, loudly interrupting my peaceful victory. As the narrative genre has officially shifted to a romantic comedy, new fundamental tropes must be strictly enforced. Prepare for excessive social misunderstandings, highly eccentric secondary characters, and incredibly contrived social situations directly leading up to the royal wedding. I opened one weary eye, glaring at the cheerfully glowing pink text. Can I at least get a single day off to just enjoy being happily engaged to a devastatingly handsome man? Before the system could generate a sarcastic response, a soft, polite knock echoed on my heavy chamber door. Enter. I called out tiredly, wrapping my plush dressing gown tighter around myself. Betty scurried nervously into the room, carefully holding a massive, silver-domed platter. Her face was flushed bright pink, and she looked equal parts utterly terrified and deeply, profoundly amused. A token of deep affection directly from the Duke, my lady, Betty stammered quietly, setting the heavy platter down on the mahogany side table. She curtsied quickly and practically sprinted completely out of the quiet room. I raised a highly suspicious eyebrow. An hour ago, he was explicitly asking for a ring featuring a root vegetable motif. I nervously gripped the ornate handle of the silver dome and slowly lifted it up. Resting perfectly in the direct center of the large platter, delicately atop a bed of pristine, crushed white velvet, was absolutely not a diamond. It was entirely not a sapphire. It was a single perfectly round, shockingly massive raw potato. A small, elegantly handwritten card was securely propped against its starchy side. My dearest Victoria, a diamond is rigid, deeply cold, and entirely fragile under extreme physical pressure. But a potato? A potato beautifully sustains life. It is highly versatile, remarkably enduring, and very much like my passionate love for you. It can be appropriately served at any meal. I eagerly await our romantic dinner this evening. Yours entirely, Arthur. I stared silently at the raw potato for a long, quiet, absolutely bewildered moment. Then, I threw my head completely back and laughed loudly until my ribs fiercely ached, the joyful sound powerfully bouncing off the walls of the grand, opulent guest room. The system's golden quill zipped quickly over to the large potato, immediately glowing a bright, blindingly happy neon yellow. Ding! Critical item successfully registered. The devoted engagement potato. Male lead affection level is currently critically unhinged. Host, I truly think you actually wrote a phenomenal literary masterpiece. I reached out, gently patting the large potato. For the very first time since violently transmigrating into this corset-bound historical nightmare, I completely, wholeheartedly agreed with the sarcastic, floating digital notepad. It definitively wasn't the sweeping, gothic emotional tragedy I had originally meticulously mapped out on my laptop. But as I fondly looked at the ridiculous, starchy token of true love, I deeply knew it was arguably the absolute best thing I had ever creatively produced. I smiled widely, utterly and completely excited for Chapter 12. Chapter 12. It had been 3 weeks since the infamous, highly chaotic incident in the decorative koi pond, and the entire high society of London was still heavily reeling from the sheer, unadulterated scandal of it all. I, Lady Victoria Blackwood, formerly a struggling and perpetually over-caffeinated novelist, was officially engaged to Duke Arthur. The fearsome, brooding, and impossibly wealthy Duke had not only willingly proposed to the realm's most notorious villainess in 2 feet of algae-infested water, but he had also proudly commissioned a custom-made, velvet-lined pedestal for my engagement potato. The massive potato currently sat in the absolute center of my primary drawing room, fiercely guarded by two incredibly confused but deeply loyal footmen who were explicitly ordered to protect the starch with their lives. "My lady, we really must finalize the floral arrangements for the chapel today," my maid, Betty, said, her voice trembling slightly as she nervously eyed the famous starchy tuber. She held a massive, heavily bound leather ledger filled with endless fabric swatches, botanical sketches, and guest lists. The Dowager Duchess has very politely suggested white lilies and delicate baby's breath to properly symbolize purity, grace, and new beginnings. I sat at my mahogany writing desk, aggressively chewing on the end of a very expensive feather quill. I just wanted a simple, quiet, entirely normal wedding. After successfully avoiding my own decapitation, battling a glowing digital interface, and shifting the entire narrative genre of my life from gothic tragedy to agricultural absurdity, I truly felt I deserved a peaceful ceremony. "Write down white lilies, Betty," I instructed tiredly, vigorously rubbing my aching temples. "And please order a very standard, incredibly undramatic white lace gown. We are going to have a boring, deeply traditional, entirely forgettable wedding. No root vegetables. No poisoned chalices. Absolutely no wildlife." Before Betty could joyfully ink the incredibly normal order into the heavy ledger, the air directly above my mahogany desk violently shimmered with digital energy. The golden quill aggressively popped into existence, glowing a blinding, offensive shade of neon orange. "System alert, boring wedding protocol detected. Request for standard white lilies denied." "Host, you are fundamentally forgetting your newly established narrative genre. Romantic comedies absolutely do not culminate in quiet, respectful, boring ceremonies. They culminate in chaotic, high-stress, wildly unpredictable public spectacles. You are strictly required to inject immediate, unhinged flair into these nuptials to maintain audience engagement." I glared vehemently at the floating orange text, aggressively resisting the sudden urge to snap my real quill completely in half. "I am the bride. I demand a boring wedding. I just want to walk down a quiet, normal aisle without the constant fear of impending doom." Mandatory plot event triggered. Schedule the wedding during a pre-existing, highly chaotic public event to maximize comedic tension. Failure to comply will automatically result in the system artificially animating your engagement potato and forcefully compelling it to perform a tap dance routine during your sacred vows. I gasped in sheer, unadulterated horror, instinctively looking over at the plush velvet pedestal. I absolutely could not risk a dancing root vegetable. It would completely break Arthur's devoted, strangely vegetable-obsessed heart. "Fine." I hissed angrily at the glowing digital air, admitting total defeat. I slowly turned back to my terrified maid, who was nervously backing away toward the heavy oak door. "Betty, permanently scratch the quiet chapel idea. What major, incredibly loud societal events are officially scheduled for next week on the expansive estate grounds?" Betty flipped frantically through the massive pages of the leather ledger. "Well, my lady, there is the annual royal fox hunt scheduled for next Tuesday. The king himself is enthusiastically attending, along with 70 highly trained hunting hounds and the entire royal cavalry." I sighed deeply, heavily resigning myself to my utterly absurd fate. "Perfect. Schedule the elderly vicar for Tuesday morning, right in the direct middle of the active hunting grounds." The following Tuesday was, exactly as predicted, an absolute, unmitigated disaster of spectacular, historically unprecedented proportions. Instead of a quiet, beautiful, stained glass chapel, my designated wedding venue was a massive, sprawling green field currently swarming with dozens of highly agitated, loudly baying hounds and impatient aristocrats mounted on massive, stomping hunting steeds. The crisp morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth, polished leather saddles, and palpable, impending chaos. I stood rigidly in the center of the muddy field, wearing a massive, heavily bustled lavender silk gown that was completely, hilariously inappropriate for the damp outdoors. Arthur stood confidently beside me, looking absolutely breathtaking in his expertly tailored crimson riding coat and polished black leather boots. He didn't seem to mind the fact that our esteemed wedding guests were currently actively blowing loud, incredibly off-key brass hunting horns. "You continue to completely amaze me, Victoria," Arthur murmured warmly, leaning close to my ear just to be properly heard over the deafening, echoing barking of the dogs. "A wedding during the royal fox hunt. It is robust. It is wonderfully wild. It is perfectly us. I just wanted standard white lilies, I muttered bitterly under my breath, desperately clutching my heavy bouquet of tightly bound, highly decorative purple turnips. The poor officiant, an elderly man named Reverend Higgins who looked entirely too fragile for this aggressive environment, stood trembling violently before us with his heavy prayer book raised high in the air. "Dearly beloved," he bravely began, shouting desperately over the blaring brass horns. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God, and several dozen hyperactive hunting dogs, to joyfully join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Get on with it, Reverend." An irritated, red-faced lord yelled from atop a massive black stallion in the front row. "The foxes are rapidly gaining a massive head start on us." The terrified Reverend gulped loudly, flipping rapidly through the thin, gold-leafed pages. "Do you, Duke Arthur, proudly take this woman?" Before the trembling man could even finish the sacred sentence, a small, incredibly fast, bright red fox shot directly through the center of our makeshift wedding party, darting right between the Reverend's shaking knees. The reaction was immediate, instantaneous, and utterly apocalyptic. 70 highly trained hunting hounds let out a collective, deafening, earth-shattering howl, and completely broke their disciplined ranks. A massive, churning wave of brown fur, sharp teeth, and floppy ears aggressively surged forward, entirely ignoring the frantic, screaming aristocrats pulling on their leashes. "Oh dear merciful heavens!" the Reverend shrieked loudly. He immediately dropped his heavy holy book, aggressively hiked up his dark ceremonial robes, and sprinted away with terrifying, highly unnatural speed. "The hunting hounds are entirely loose," Betty screamed frantically from the muddy sidelines, desperately waving my heavy leather ledger wildly in the air. The entire royal wedding rapidly dissolved into total, beautiful, unbridled anarchy. The pack of hounds chased the terrified vicar directly toward a massive, towering green hedgerow. With a frantic, adrenaline-fueled leap of pure survival, the elderly holy man vaulted entirely over the thick green hedge, completely disappearing from sight with a loud, branch-snapping crash, closely followed by 3 extremely determined, loudly baying beagles. Wealthy aristocrats were comically falling off their panicked horses. The King of England was laughing hysterically from a safe distance. The brass horns were frantically blaring completely out of tune. I stood entirely frozen amidst the absolute, swirling pandemonium, tightly holding my heavy bouquet of root vegetables, entirely unsure if I was legally married or just participating in a bizarre fever dream. The system's golden quill zoomed directly in front of my face, flashing a bright, celebratory, blindingly happy neon green. Ding! Maximum comedic absurdity successfully achieved. Narrative climax successfully executed. You may now proudly kiss the handsome groom. I didn't even have adequate time to properly process the glowing digital text. Arthur stepped forward smoothly, entirely unbothered by the sheer, unmitigated destruction actively surrounding us. His icy blue eyes were incredibly warm, dancing with that incredible, intoxicating amusement I had grown to entirely love. He wrapped his strong, powerful arms around my heavily corseted waist, and pulled me firmly against his solid, broad chest. "I genuinely believe the good vicar skipped directly to the end, my darling love," Arthur whispered softly, his deep, resonant baritone rumbling wonderfully against my skin. "I strongly think our official officiant is currently trapped in a large oak tree," I replied breathlessly, looking at the distant, violently shaking hedgerow. "Then we shall simply have to finalize the binding contract ourselves," he murmured confidently. Amidst the deafening, echoing barks of the royal hounds, the frantic, terrified shouting of the British aristocracy, and the distant, muffled cries of the fleeing Reverend, Arthur pulled me in for a sweeping, breathtaking, utterly perfect, intensely romantic kiss. My heavy lavender silk skirts rustled wildly in the crisp wind, and for the absolute first time in my entire chaotic transmigration experience, I completely forgot about the glowing system, the terrible plot, and the restrictive corset. I dropped the heavy bouquet of turnips into the muddy grass, wrapping my arms tightly around his neck. It was completely absurd. It was perfect. Chapter 13. It had been precisely 1 month since our disastrous, hound-infested, completely unforgettable royal wedding. I was now officially the Duchess, and my notoriously chaotic reputation across London had only violently solidified. However, as the crisp, cool autumn winds began to aggressively strip the leaves from the ancient trees lining the grand estate, A dark, suffocating cloud of impending doom rapidly descended upon my newly found matrimonial bliss. Today was the dreaded Tuesday. It was the exact, specific date originally slated for the catastrophic events of Chapter 20. It was the fateful, doomed day that the brooding male lead of my Gothic masterpiece was explicitly fated to suffer a highly dramatic, tragically fatal accident. I sat rigidly in the center of the sunlit morning room, desperately trying to manage my spiraling anxiety. To keep my hands from violently trembling, I had recently taken up designing, crafting, and frantically producing handmade crochet accessories. While the other delicate ladies of the ton quietly embroidered tiny, unassuming lilies onto silk handkerchiefs, I aggressively wielded a carved bone hook, rapidly looping thick, charcoal-colored yarn. The repetitive mathematical precision of counting the stitches thoroughly grounded my frayed, terrified nerves. I had already successfully crocheted several large, velvet-textured scrunchies to tightly secure my unruly raven hair, and I was currently halfway through constructing a heavy, structural top meant to serve as a winter cravat for Arthur. Given my current frantic speed, however, it was rapidly beginning to resemble a small, impenetrable woolen defensive shield. Suddenly, the warm air directly above my massive pile of dark yarn violently shimmered. The golden quill aggressively exploded into existence, its translucent feathers vibrating with urgent, frantic digital energy. It did not glow with the cheerful pink or celebratory green of our recent romantic victories. It flashed a stark, blinding, terrifyingly urgent shade of hazard warning yellow. System alert, temporal convergence approaching. Warning host. Today aligns directly with the original timeline of the male lead's scheduled demise. Although you successfully deleted the equestrian accident, the universal narrative algorithm is actively seeking a dramatic replacement. The air is dangerously thick with fatal probability. Extreme caution is strictly advised for the next 12 hours. I gasped loudly, completely dropping my crochet hook. The heavy ball of charcoal yarn unraveled, rolling rapidly across the expensive Persian rug. A replacement? I hissed vehemently at the floating text, my heart slamming violently against my rigid corset. You promised me the guillotine was dismantled. You promised the tragedy was completely averted. The guillotine is indeed dismantled. However, the universe abhors a vacuum. If a heavy ornate chandelier happens to mysteriously plummet, or a perfectly healthy staircase suddenly collapses, I cannot be held legally responsible. Keep him entirely stationary. I didn't wait for another warning. I hiked up my heavy, emerald green morning skirts and sprinted frantically out of the room, my leather boots loudly echoing down the massive marble corridors. I needed to completely neutralize all physical threats. I needed a room with zero heavy overhead lighting, no precarious ledges, and absolutely zero access to wild animals or root vegetables. I found exactly what I was looking for on the ground floor. The secondary winter linen closet. It was essentially a small, windowless, heavily fortified mahogany box designed to protect expensive, imported quilts from hungry moths. Now I just needed to lure the most powerful duke in the realm inside. I found Arthur casually lounging in his expansive, leather-bound study, sipping a cup of dark coffee while reviewing complex estate taxation ledgers. He looked devastatingly handsome, wearing a relaxed, unbuttoned white linen shirt that expertly highlighted his broad shoulders. Arthur, I gasped, leaning heavily against the oak doorframe, completely out of breath. I require your immediate, undivided assistance in the ground floor linen corridor. He looked up, his icy blue eyes instantly crinkling with that familiar, soul-crushing amusement. He set his porcelain cup down gracefully. Has a rogue, highly aggressive badger infiltrated the textiles, my love? Or are we simply continuing our rich tradition of partaking in profoundly odd daytime activities? Just come with me, I pleaded wildly, grabbing his large, warm hand and practically dragging his tall frame down the hallway. When we reached the heavy mahogany door of the closet, I confidently threw it open, revealing the small, dimly lit, incredibly cramped space stacked high with thick wool blankets. Step inside, please, I instructed firmly, gesturing toward the dark, windowless interior. Arthur paused, raising a perfectly sculpted raven eyebrow. He looked at the tiny closet, then looked down at my wild, panicked expression. Victoria, darling, while I am usually highly enthusiastic about any deeply questionable scheme you concoct, I feel I must logically point out that I am well over 6 feet tall, and that is a closet specifically designed for quilts. It is a matter of absolute vital national security, I insisted, aggressively pushing against his solid chest until he finally, reluctantly stepped backward into the cramped space. Before he could properly ask another logical question, I slammed the heavy mahogany door shut and quickly turned the thick brass key in the lock. The satisfying click echoed loudly in the quiet hallway. He was safe. He was completely encased in protective winter wool. No falling chandeliers could reach him here. Victoria. Arthur's deep, muffled baritone vibrated through the heavy wood. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound panicked. He sounded thoroughly, undeniably entertained. Is this an incredibly avant-garde, new courtship ritual, my love? Or have I finally been officially imprisoned for my atrocious poetry? You are staying in there until the sun completely sets. I yelled passionately at the brass keyhole. I am forcefully protecting you from the universe. Please sit on a blanket and do not make any sudden, dangerous movements. As you wish, my delightfully unhinged captor. Arthur called back cheerfully. I sat directly on the cold marble floor in front of the door, aggressively resuming my crochet project, determined to guard the entrance with my life. The hours ticked by agonizingly slowly. Around noon, Higgins the butler appeared, carrying a silver tray meant for lunch. He stared completely blankly at me sitting on the floor, surrounded by yards of dark purple yarn. Lady Victoria, Higgins intoned smoothly, his steel spine perfectly rigid. I was informed the Duke was entirely missing from his study. He is securely quarantined, I replied flatly, aggressively hooking another loop of yarn. A sharp, rhythmic tapping suddenly came from the brass keyhole. Higgins. Arthur's muffled voice called out happily. Is that you? Splendid. Do you happen to have a deck of cards on your person? I always carry a deck, Your Grace, Higgins replied without missing a single highly professional beat. For the next 6 absolute hours, the most formidable, impossibly wealthy man in the entire realm sat happily in a dark, cramped broom closet, cheerfully sliding playing cards one by one under the narrow crack of the mahogany door to play an aggressive, highly competitive game of blackjack with his stoic butler. I continued to crochet my defensive garment, listening to the two men quietly gamble away the estate's minor silver holdings, entirely baffled by the sheer, unmitigated absurdity of my successfully rewritten romance novel. Chapter 14. The sun began its agonizingly slow descent below the sprawling, manicured horizon of the Blackwood estate, casting long, dramatic, and intensely terrifying shadows across the marble floors of the hallway. I had not moved a single inch from my defensive position in front of the heavy linen closet door. My hands were heavily cramped, and I had successfully crocheted what could only be described as a charcoal-colored, highly defensive woolen barricade that stretched halfway across the corridor. Inside the cramped closet, the high-stakes game of sliding blackjack had finally, mercifully concluded. Higgins the butler had methodically, ruthlessly bankrupted the most powerful duke in the realm, smoothly collecting his winnings of invisible silver shillings through the narrow brass keyhole, before politely excusing himself to oversee the preparation of the evening roast. I was left entirely alone in the dimming hallway, clutching my bone crochet hook like a lethal weapon, my eyes fixed intently on the large grandfather clock ticking ominously at the end of the corridor. The original manuscript strictly dictated that the tragic, fatal equestrian accident would definitively occur exactly at twilight. The air around my head began to violently hum, vibrating with that familiar, nerve-shredding digital energy. The golden quill materialized slowly, its translucent feathers glowing a stark, pulsing bright red. System alert, twilight event horizon reached. Commencing final narrative probability scan. Please remain absolutely stationary. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my back pressed firmly against the solid wood of the door. I could hear Arthur shifting inside, the rustle of heavy winter quilts muffled by the mahogany. Victoria. Arthur called out softly, his deep voice laced with a sudden uncharacteristic touch of genuine concern. The sun has set. The hallway is entirely silent. Are you quite all right out there, my darling warden? Do not move. I shrieked frantically, abandoning my massive pile of dark yarn, and throwing my arms wide across the door frame in a dramatic, entirely unnecessary pose of ultimate protection. The narrative algorithm is actively scanning. If you sneeze, a chandelier might spontaneously materialize and crush us both. Inside the closet, Arthur simply let out a low, incredibly fond sigh. I assure you, my love, the only thing currently threatening to crush me is a particularly heavy, aggressively floral-scented wool blanket that has somehow collapsed onto my left shoulder. Scanning. Scanning. The golden quill zipped erratically back and forth, the red light casting frantic, eerie shadows against the patterned wallpaper. Probability of fatal accident. 85%. 60%. 30%. The heavy pendulum of the grandfather clock swung back and forth, each loud, metallic tick and tock echoing like a deafening gunshot in the dead silence of the corridor. I squeezed my crimson eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable sound of breaking glass, collapsing stone, or an inexplicably loose cannonball rolling down the grand staircase. Tick, tock, tick, tock, zong. The heavy, resonant chime of the grandfather clock striking the final hour of twilight vibrated through the floorboards. I waited entirely frozen, for the universe to violently rip my happy ending away. But nothing happened. No chandeliers fell. No stairs collapsed. The decorative suits of armor lining the hall remained entirely stationary. The golden quill froze in mid-air. The blinding, terrifying red strobe light suddenly flickered, sputtered, and completely died out. For a split second, the hallway was plunged into total, suffocating darkness. Then, with a joyful melodic, incredibly loud digital chime that sounded remarkably like a heavenly choir of synthetic angels, the quill exploded into a blinding, euphoric shower of neon pink, bright green, and dazzling gold sparks. Ding! Critical milestone successfully reached. The text unfurled in a beautiful, flowing, elegant script that illuminated the entire corridor in a warm, triumphant glow. Chapter 20 deadline, officially passed. Tragic climax, successfully averted. Survival rate, 100%. Congratulations, host. The deeply contrived, utterly depressing Gothic tragedy has been permanently, irrevocably deleted from the universal database. You have successfully conquered your narrative block. The plot is entirely your own. You are free. A massive, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated relief crashed over me, completely washing away weeks of suffocating corset-bound terror. I let out a loud, breathless sob of sheer joy, my knees giving out entirely as I slumped against the heavy mahogany door. My trembling, yarn-callous fingers scrambled frantically for the thick brass key still resting securely inside the lock. I gripped it tightly, twisting it with all the remaining strength I possessed. The lock disengaged with a loud, incredibly satisfying click. I threw the heavy wooden door wide open, stumbling backward over my massive pile of charcoal yarn. Arthur stepped out of the cramped, windowless closet, looking utterly devastating despite being lightly covered in tiny white lint particles from the heavy winter quilts. He blinked against the warm, glowing light of the triumphant digital system, his icy blue eyes instantly zeroing in on my tear-streaked, deeply relieved face. He didn't ask a question about the floating, glowing text. He didn't question why I was crying on the floor. He simply closed the short distance between us, dropping gracefully to his knees right into the tangled mess of my defensive crochet project, and pulled me fiercely into his broad, solid chest. Took you entirely long enough, my delightfully chaotic warden. Arthur murmured warmly against my raven hair, his strong arms wrapping around me like an impenetrable, highly romantic fortress. You are officially safe, I whispered breathlessly, burying my face into his crisp linen shirt, breathing in the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and absolute victory. We both are, Victoria, he promised softly, tilting my chin up to capture my lips in a sweeping, completely cliché, utterly perfect, intensely passionate embrace that finally, definitively, cured my writer's block forever. Epilogue. 5 years is a remarkably long, highly eventful time in the fast-paced, deeply judgmental world of British high society. In a standard, predictable historical romance novel, 5 years of marriage would traditionally result in the formerly wicked Villainess fading quietly into a life of subdued, polite domesticity. She would learn to embroider. She would host excruciatingly boring afternoon tea parties with dry biscuits, and she would gently nod along to the mind-numbing gossip of the ton. Naturally, as the author of my own completely derailed narrative, I absolutely refused to do any of that. Lady Victoria, Duchess of Blackwood, was officially universally recognized as the absolute, unmitigated scandal of the realm, and I wore the title like a glittering diamond tiara. The aristocracy had entirely given up on trying to predict our behavior. They had long since learned that an invitation to a Blackwood estate gala meant you were highly likely to be subjected to a chaotic hound petting zoo, a competitive game of indoor croquet, or a towering, intricately carved centerpiece made entirely out of raw root vegetables. I reclined languidly on a massive, sprawling emerald green velvet chaise lounge positioned perfectly in the center of the sun-drenched morning room. The suffocating, steel-boned corsets of my tragic past had been permanently banished, replaced by flowing, obscenely comfortable silk day gowns. Surrounding me on the velvet cushions was a massive, chaotic sea of thick charcoal yarn, and several finished handmade crochet scrunchies. I had recently taken to aggressively crafting heavy woolen tops and accessories, which Arthur stubbornly and proudly wore during the brutal, freezing English winters, entirely regardless of how much they clashed with his bespoke tailored coats. I popped a plump, green grape into my mouth and stared thoughtfully at the vaulted ceiling. "All right, strike that last line," I instructed loudly, waving my hand in the air. "It is entirely too brooding. We are aiming for light-hearted banter, not a gothic existential crisis. The hero shouldn't stare out the rain-streaked window. He should accidentally trip over the decorative rug while trying to bow." Across the room, sitting diligently at a delicate, spindly mahogany writing desk that looked hilariously small beneath his massive, broad-shouldered frame, was the most powerful duke in the realm. Arthur chuckled, a rich, deep, incredibly warm sound that still managed to send an involuntary, highly pleasant shiver directly down my spine. He dipped a standard, non-magical feather quill into a pot of dark ink, and elegantly struck a line through the parchment. He had entirely abandoned his terrifying, stoic persona to embrace his true calling, serving as my incredibly devoted, highly overqualified personal scribe. "Tripping over the rug," Arthur repeated smoothly, his icy blue eyes dancing with that familiar, devastating amusement as he quickly jotted down my new dictation. "A masterful comedic choice, my love. Though I must ask, is the heroine going to catch him? Or is she going to aggressively shove a dry pastry into his face to establish dominance?" "That depends entirely on her mood," I replied, grabbing another grape. "But I am leaning heavily toward the pastry. It establishes a strong thematic precedent for the sequel." As Arthur dutifully recorded the pastry assault into the manuscript, the warm morning air directly above his dark raven hair suddenly shimmered with a familiar, faint digital hum. The golden quill popped lazily into existence. It did not flash with frantic red sirens or panic-inducing yellow warnings. It glowed a soft, incredibly relaxed, almost sleepy shade of pastel blue. It floated casually over Arthur's shoulder, hovering intently over the parchment, effectively acting as an interdimensional, highly judgmental spell checker. System note: you misspelled catastrophic, Your Grace. There is only one net. Arthur didn't even flinch. Over the last 5 years, he had completely accepted the fact that I was permanently accompanied by an invisible, highly opinionated digital ghost that occasionally communicated through me. "Ah, my apologies," Arthur said cheerfully to the empty air, meticulously correcting the spelling on the thick parchment. "Thank you for the editorial oversight." The golden quill zipped over to my chaise lounge, twirling in a slow, bored circle. "Host, I must formally log a complaint." The pastel blue text unfurled lazily in the air. "This new manuscript is completely devoid of high-stakes suffering. Where is the betrayal? Where is the life-threatening illness? We have gone 5 full years without a single public execution or fatal equestrian accident. It is disgustingly, horrifically domestic in this household. My dramatic tension metrics are practically collecting dust." I laughed brightly, tossing a ball of charcoal yarn playfully at the floating digital text. It phased right through the glowing letters, bouncing harmlessly onto the Persian rug. "You are just going to have to suffer through the happiness," I told the system with a massive, unrepentant grin. I never did get over my severe writer's block for sweeping, miserable tragedies. I am officially, permanently retired from the genre of pain. I am strictly a best-selling author of unhinged romantic comedies now. System sigh fine. But if you do not include at least one mildly chaotic misunderstanding involving a farm animal in Chapter 4, I am forcefully changing the font to Comic Sans. With that final, terrifying digital threat, the golden quill dissolved into a shower of soft blue sparks, leaving the morning room entirely in peace. Arthur set his quill down and stood up, abandoning the manuscript. He closed the distance between the small desk and my chaise lounge with long, confident strides. He looked absolutely breathtaking in the morning light, the sharp planes of his face softened by years of genuine, unburdened joy. He didn't sit in the armchair beside me. Instead, he crowded onto the velvet chaise lounge, his large frame easily gathering me up into his arms, completely ignoring the scattered crochet scrunchies and balls of yarn. Writer's block permanently cured then? Arthur murmured, his lips brushing softly against my temple, breathing in the scent of my lavender soap. Entirely, I whispered, resting my head against his solid chest, listening to the steady, reassuring thud of his heartbeat. Though I must admit, I find my primary source of inspiration is incredibly distracting. Arthur smiled, a devastating, brilliantly wicked expression. He reached into the deep pocket of his charcoal trousers. Well, my brilliant Duchess, if you find yourself lacking in inspiration today, I have brought you a small token to spark your creative genius. He pulled his hand out and gently placed the object directly onto my lap. It was a turnip. A perfectly round, incredibly fresh, vibrant purple turnip, tied meticulously with a delicate, expensive silver silk ribbon. I stared at the root vegetable. A massive, overwhelming wave of absolute love swelling in my chest. I looked up into the stormy, adoring eyes of the man I had accidentally designed, nearly murdered, and subsequently fallen hopelessly in love with. It is breathtaking, I managed to say, fighting back a sudden happy tear. Only the absolute best for the greatest writer in the realm, Arthur whispered fiercely, pulling me up by the waist. He kissed me, a deep sweeping, entirely perfect kiss that tasted of coffee and absolute devotion. It was the exact kind of kiss that belonged on the final, triumphant page of a novel. My life was no longer a tragedy. It wasn't a strict script, and it certainly wasn't a predictable, boring romance. It was messy, it was chaotic, it was filled with root vegetables, and it was entirely, beautifully my own. That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.